Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Dow Jones webinar, which today is about the African section and African input into the Panama Papers investigation. I've asked a couple of guests to join us today. First of all, we have Fitzgibbon from the ICFJ, and he'll be telling us a bit about the overall generalist look at the Panama Papers and a bit about the ICFJ. Then we have Amanda Strydom, who's the managing editor of ANCIR. ANCIR is the African Network of Centers for Investigative Reporting, and that's the African organization which handled the African part of the Panama Papers, and we'll run through the timeline for that as well. And then we have Sharife, who is our WizKid investigator and the editor for ANCIR. She unfortunately claims not to have a camera on her laptop, so we won't see her today, but we'll hopefully be able to hear from her. We'd like you to send us some questions on Twitter or on Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer them. This should take probably around half an hour, and what we hope to do is to give you some insight into the process, Panama Papers, and then specifically what the experience was of the 13 or so African newsrooms that collaborated on Panama Papers, what the successes were, what some of the issues were, and where we think this will take journalism and what the future of journalism holds in Africa in terms of the Panama Papers. So let me start off by asking Will to chip in here and to give us perhaps a quick recap on Panama Papers. And we might not think this is necessary because it's been all over the news, but it's probably useful for those of you who haven't been paying absolute attention to get a bit of a recap. Will.
Thanks, Chris, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. I work for ICFJ. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and ICFJ first began what became Panama Papers really in February 2015. That's when the German journalists who first received the leak of 11.5 million documents turned to ICFJ and said, oh my goodness, there's so much information here. It's information that touches every country in every corner of the globe. One newsroom alone can't do it. Help us construct a team, a global partnership of journalists who can tell stories that matters in each country. So for the next year, ICFJ and all of its partners, that soon grew to nearly 400 different journalists in about 80 different countries, started delving into these 11 million documents. And 1 year later, we saw the impact. We saw prime ministers and leaders of countries who resigned or were placed under intense scrutiny. We saw promised reforms to the global offshore financial system that for many years, many wonderful journalists and experts have been saying is something that in many cases is fundamentally unfair and needs to be reformed. I'll leave it at there, I think. Chris, back to you.
Thanks. Do we have Khadija with us? Nope, doesn't sound like it. So I'm going to step in for Khadija and tell you about ANCIR. So ICFJ approached ANCIR and ANCIR is a kind of a federation or a loose network of investigative newsrooms around Africa. And what ANCIR does is it provides a couple of things. One is that it helps to pioneer new ways of doing journalism, which of course the Panama Papers is an example. It also provides what we call an iLab service to newsrooms around Africa. And what that is that it provides certain experts in, for example, things like prosecutorial analysis, things like financial forensic analysis, provides experts who work with newsrooms across Africa to kind of, I guess, stress test and panel beat stories. So what it does is it kind of provides a layer which allows you to prepare stories and big investigative stories in a way that makes them legally defensible and ethically defensible. So ANCIR is based in South Africa and works, as I said, across Africa. I was going to ask Khadija to tell us exactly what ICFJ asked ANCIR to do, but Will, perhaps you could step in there and give us a quick summary of that.
Absolutely. ICFJ has worked with Khadija and ANCIR and a number of ANCIR founders, such as Justin Arenstein and ANCIR partners for many years. So we had the fundamental basics of a relationship that existed already. And as you can imagine, as a journalist working with a leak, especially a leak that you think may have significant international consequences, ICFJ needed to be careful and have significant trust in who we worked with. So the fact that we'd worked with ANCIR before on previous investigations meant that it was a no-brainer. We knew that in order for the best stories to be told across a continent as big as Africa, as diverse as Africa, and frankly, with which is such a victim of offshore financial flows, we needed to turn to a group like Africa, like ANCIR, who could reach out to new partners and help them along the journey. We're talking here about 11.5 million files, don't forget. Lots of this is really boring, it's really complicated, and it doesn't make much sense. So ANCIR, I think it's fair to say, we couldn't have done this job without ANCIR. They were the ones who provided the technical, editorial, and logistical support to enable this collaboration really to be as big and successful as it had become. So I contacted Khadija and Justin Arenstein and I said, ICFJ needs you guys, Panama Papers project needs you guys so that we can tell the stories that matter from Cape Town to Cairo.
And I guess it's probably worth mentioning at this point that there are only three and a half, because Khadija can hear us but can't speak, 3.5 of us on this call, but obviously the point of this kind of journalism is that it's massively collaborative. So ANCIR and ICFJ worked with a number of partners across Africa, and we're hoping in a subsequent webinar to get some of them on to tell us about the actual nitty-gritty of working on individual stories. But Amanda, perhaps you could run us through who the partners were, and maybe highlight one or two of the stories that they wrote.
So we had about 9 partners across Africa, all ranging from English, French, right through to Portuguese, and we also worked in some countries that don't have free press. So a lot of the investigation had to happen from South Africa. So our big stories was definitely from Botswana, which showed links to a chief or to a judge and undeclared assets that he had. From Kenya, we had a very similar story with also judges who didn't declare assets, and it's caused conversations around that to see that in order to make judiciary fair, there should be a better declaration of assets.
Chris, are you there?
Oh, you can't hear me. Sorry, I'll start over. Right. On the screen we have our main ANCIR partners, which are full members of ANCIR. So and the countries covered are Tunisia, Botswana, Namibia, Mali, Senegal, Uganda, Kenya, Zimbabwe. But obviously there were quite a few stories from other countries which aren't up on screen. So I think, for example, the Sierra Leone story, which if we're going to talk about impact on stories, the Sierra Leone story started a government investigation into undervaluation of diamonds, and those are the kinds of impacts we had. But I guess people would like to hear perhaps a bit more about the structure and timeline of this. So perhaps Will and Amanda, you could jointly run us through the timeline of the years worth of work.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. As I said earlier, Panama Papers, well, what became Panama Papers, because it wasn't known as that at the time, began really in February 2015. There were a series of meetings that took place in the United States, in Germany and in London, where participating journalists got together. That's really important in an investigation this size, because if you're going to spend up to 1 year of your life digging into these documents, you need to know and understand that it's really important and that you have a global network of support. So what's great about these kind of ANCIR, ICIJ investigations is that no one's alone, and that we have forums and tools that allow you to communicate with other journalists, to share findings, and to basically keep motivated over 12 months of research. In Africa in particular, we were very lucky with Code for Africa and ANCIR, who organised a meeting for African partners in Johannesburg in 2015. And once again, that was crucial. That enabled us to put our heads together, to look through documents, and to find what would become the first kernels of long-form stories. ICIJ, through its data team and with data help from Code for Africa, made available all of the 11.5 million documents to every partner equally. Our interest is not providing the Botswana files to the Botswanan journalists and the Kenyan files to the Kenyan journalists. Our principle at ICIJ, and that's what I love about ICIJ and ANCIR's work, is we say all journalists are equal. It doesn't matter if you work for the BBC in London or for Dépêche du Mali in Mali. You have the same access to the documents and you can find the stories that matter for you. But of course, that takes lots of time and often lots of dead-end searches. So when we met in Johannesburg, we came up with ways to find stories that matter and search tools that could be used by all kinds of journalists. And that's really when everyone then went back to their newsroom and started digging, because obviously you don't just use leaked documents alone. You had to make sure, first of all, that those documents were accurate. Is the judge in Kenya who appears in the files the same judge who you think sits on the Supreme Court? Are there any court documents or parliamentary or government investigations in other cases that you can use to flesh out your story so that it moves from being a leak-based investigation to a true investigative investigation? And that was something that individual journalists in their newsroom did for months, nearly every day, I think, in many cases, going to ANCIR, Khadija and the experts for help, to ask for questions, to submit drafts so that it could be fact-checked, verified by lawyers, and all kinds of other assets that I'm sure Chris and Amanda are better to speak to than I am.
Yeah, Amanda, perhaps you want to talk us a bit through the kind of, I mean, Luel's kind of looked at how we unpack the stories and with journalists. Maybe talk us a bit about the process of liaising with newsrooms and the editing process and the actual final rush of publishing. Just on the day we published, I was busy traveling, so it was pretty exciting. Every time I got to a new airport, which okay was only twice, to turn on my laptop and see the world tumbling around a lot of people's ears. Maybe you could give us a bit of an insight into that, Amanda.
So we put together a website to launch the stories on. The first stories rather launched on the 4th of April on the evening, and as we saw it breaking on Twitter, we were still kind of desperately editing down stories and finalizing last minute changes. But it was very much a situation of newsrooms working with Khadija on the data, finding stories, doing the research on them, and rushing to between the prosecutorial editor, between the economics editor, to make sure that the stories were entirely bulletproof and entirely safe to publish. Yeah, that was pretty much the rush of the evening.
And let me just emphasize again that Khadija would be talking for herself, but she's having technology issues. And actually that's one of the problems which you face in collaborative journalism across various African countries. We'll talk about that a bit later. Well, do you maybe want to give us a bit more of an insight into the technology behind this? So looking at Blacklight, looking at Oxbow, what's it called?
Foxwall.
Oxtail, I can't remember, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe give us a bit of insight into that. And I think that, what I'm really asking for is a kind of a quite simplified description of how one mines such a huge whack of data.
Mm. So there were at least 3 online secure platforms that ICIJ made available to all partners as part of Panama Papers. The most important of that, obviously, was the secure online platform where the documents could be searched in and of themselves. And here we're talking about passports, we're talking about contracts for diamond sales, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of emails, audio recordings, Microsoft Excel spreadsheets. So how do you search these things? It's complicated is the short answer. The longer answer is we built a system that could be searched simply almost like Google. So your first search might be Joseph Kabila in the Congo if you're interested to see if his name popped up. But of course, it rarely was as simple as that, and Kabila's name itself never popped up in the files. So there were ways to search. Maybe you just wanted to search by key terms relating to South Africa, Sierra Leone, your country of interest. Once you understood further the offshore industry, you got a sense of, okay, what are some key terms that might be red flags here? For example, if the company that has created an offshore company for a former Nigerian oil minister finds out that that oil minister has been found guilty of fraud, there are certain words, obviously, that they might send each other internally in emails that could lead you to an interesting discovery to show more details about that story. So this platform was crucial to find the information that would launch stories. The second important secure platform and technology was what's called Global iHub, that is basically a Facebook secure platform for partner journalists. That's where you could send private messages to other journalists. Say if you're working on a story about diamonds in Botswana, but you're also interested in the same country that has a diamond license in Sierra Leone, you could communicate with a colleague there and say, hey, this is what I found. Are you finding similar things in your country? iHub, or this social network platform, also allowed us to communicate with each other if we had problems to announce. Say if someone was putting pressure on us days before publication, you could put a note there in the Global iHub, and that might encourage other journalists to not only give you moral support, but say, hey, well, maybe I'll run that story too in my newspaper on day 2 so that you won't be alone. And that kind of collegiality and support network was really crucial to, I think, improve the quality of the stories, because all of a sudden it makes it a global newsroom, but also just to keep journalists often doing hard work in hard countries on the same track.
And I guess the question that I went to a Panama Papers talk at a Global Editors Network conference a couple of weeks ago, where the Peter Bale, I think the head of ICFJ, and some of the technologists who first made the leaks available and took delivery of the data. We're talking about how they took delivery, and apparently it was actually at various conferences around the world where a disk would be delivered with this data on. And the big question everybody was asking was, how could you possibly have, was it 380 journalists or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 380 journalists working on a story for a year and it not being leaked. What's the answer to that?
I think the answer really is trust. Every journalist that we worked with, we tried to know about them in advance, and we tried at every stage to encourage them to think not just of your own personal story in your own country, but to say, yes, this is a big story, but think about how much bigger it will be if you work together with us. And I think people understood that message. And this, by the way, is a developing form of journalism, as we said we'd talk about. I think over recent years we've seen journalists better understand that just like criminal networks work globally and with networks across the world, so too can journalists in order to improve their product. I think we've really seen a move away from the lone wolf model of journalism, where it's one man who smokes too much and drinks too much coffee in his living room, working alone to produce a scoop, and rather moving towards a world in which 10, 20, 100, 200 or 380 journalists work together to produce something. And it was hard. We had to organise and discuss really specific details that newsrooms usually don't want to hand over to a third party. What day do we publish? What time of day do we publish? What's the name of the project? Not every partner thought that Panama Papers was the best title for this investigation, for example. So all of these things had to be discussed in as democratic a way as possible.
It still seems a bit of a miracle, but anyway. Let's talk a bit about and I want to talk a bit more about the newish collaborative model of journalism, which is in many markets quite antithetical to what the business of journalism purports to be about. So, but before we do that, or perhaps we can do it as part of this process, let's talk about some of the successes that ANCIR and its partners had with working on the Panama Papers. Because obviously there are different conditions that apply within the African context than within the European or North American context. So I guess, and Amanda, perhaps you could speak to this. So I guess two of the big successes were how many newsrooms we got to work together and how many stories we managed to do.
So we had an average of, well, we had 14 newsrooms, 9 newsrooms. We had about 14 journalists working on stories. As I mentioned earlier, they were in French, Portuguese, English. So we worked with a number of, we had to work with a number of language editors as well as the prosecutorial and the economic editors. One of the big successes certainly is the fact that we managed to cater across a continent. Sort of, I think we forget that, you know, it's not the same. It's not, every country has its own limitations, has its own expectations, has its own laws that govern freedom of the press, and that we managed to kind of publish in 9 different countries, I think, across Africa in various different languages. So one of the successes that is also definitely mentionable is the fact that the AU picked up on the Panama Papers and also has issued warnings to a number of governments demanding that they investigate names that have been released, names and companies that have been released.
And I guess the Khadija would want me to say this, but the big weapon in the ANCIR arsenal is the prosecutorial editing. So the fact that you can a story can not be reductively looked at by lawyers, but actually positively looked at by our prosecutorial expert Heinrich, and you know, kind of really panel beat it so that it's checked for corroboration, consistency, bias, and that basically it's prepared for if you ever get sued as a journalist or as a media organization, you've basically already got all your answers in place for you know, for any legal issues that might come down the road. Let's talk a bit more about some of the more interesting curveball issues that we encountered while working on this. And you know, maybe you can speak a bit more to these, but I guess one of them is that unlike in North America, some journalists in some of the territories we worked in have to be paid to do these stories because their newsrooms don't actually give them the resources to be able to work on them. So, you know, a lot of them had to do these stories in their spare time because their newsrooms are so under-resourced, and this is true in South Africa as well, so under-resourced that you actually can't afford to get a journalist working on a story for, I mean, we could call it a year in this case. So we had to pay some journalists, and I think that's well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's pretty different to some of the European and North American experiences. Yeah, Will's nodding. He's on mute, but he's nodding.
That's right. I think we have Khadija who's available to speak now, Chris.
Khadija, do you want to maybe speak to some of the successes and some of the issues around it?
I've so enjoyed listening to you. I think I'll just wait until.
No, don't go crazy on us. Speak to the world and tell us. Perhaps maybe give us a bit more insight into some of the kind of hurdles that you had overcome, or just some of the successes.
I think it was a very successful initiative, as Amanda and Chris mentioned, because it showed a level of trust and networking in terms of a transnational investigation that ordinarily would have been very difficult to keep under wraps. So there was that level of teamwork and of integrity in the process. And as the journalists needed to start interviewing the companies and the governments, we were able to encourage them, and they themselves proposed using the leak as a lead and finding public or alluvial information, maybe other stories that had already been done, insider information, to try and raise it from a different angle without necessarily exposing that it was the leak that was causing them to approach the story. So I thought that was a very ingenious way of African media beginning to dig and mine into the story without exposing the source.
And I know you're very conscious of the fact that so many people worked on these stories, and that we really should be giving credit to a lot of people who aren't on this webinar, and who are dotted all around Africa. So maybe you want to give us just one or two of what you consider to be the top stories with kind of really impactful outcomes.
We had several countries that didn't have media partners, for example, in Sierra Leone, Angola, Guinea, and in those cases, we did the stories in-house working with very talented investigative reporters or researchers. In countries like Tunisia, so the entire continent has different political regimes in place, different strengths and weaknesses, and in countries like Tunisia, we found that the journalists were under severe harassment, threat, and intimidation, which was quite different to a country like Namibia or Botswana, where the stories would be picked up and proposed in the public interest, and that the media would be a vehicle for people to actually engage with their governments, which was very different from the North African regimes. So it is interesting to see the different political economies and the different types of threats that emerged in this type of situation.
And I guess we're probably winding down now, so maybe we could chat a little bit about what this kind of collaboration means for journalism. I mean, one of the things that struck me was that the New York Times were approached to be a collaborator on the Panama Papers, and turned that down because they wanted a kind of a single title publishing rights. I think that's the story. And I think now that New York Times has changed and have now become a partner with the ICIJ, and Will can pick this up if he wants. They've become a partner with the ICIJ because they've realized that, in fact, well, I'm assuming they've realized that, in fact, the future of massive data journalism stories now is going to have to be collaboration for a bunch of reasons. One is that you need a hell of a lot more people to look at, 11.6 million documents. You can't afford to do that. You can't afford the time or the resources as just a single title, or even a handful of titles, as it was with the Snowden leaks. And the other reason is that stories are not about localized single places anymore. Stories are global. I mean, we're starting to be able to unpack the massively complicated and complex relationships between corrupt politicians and criminals. Will, I don't know if you want to maybe speak to that?
Yes, I think you're right, Chris. I think Panama Papers really has finally knocked down the remaining individual journalists and entities that previously I think were less than enthusiastic about collaborative journalism. And it's not just large American papers. ICFJ approached a number of different organizations, including some in Africa, who ultimately decided that Panama Papers wasn't something that either they could do or that they were interested in. And I imagine there are a few regrets around the continent still today. And I do suspect that this is the kind of project and style that will continue to exist. ICFJ knows from past experiences that leaks beget leaks, and we know now, based on the success of this and previous projects, that we can go to ANCIR immediately and to partner newsrooms across Africa, and there will be a trustworthy, professional, and very talented skill base that will enable us to explore stories that a fool like me, an Australian citizen sitting in Washington, D.C., would never be able to find on his own.
Yeah. And by the way, Amanda and Khalid, if you want to jump in here, please do. And I guess the next important lesson that we certainly learned from the African side is that something like the ANCIR iLab is essential if we're going to grow investigative journalism across Africa. There are just in the same way that collaboration is the new journalism for reasons of editorial quality as well as being able to mine data, I think collaboration amongst ANCIR African newsrooms is also essential, because we just do not have the resources in most of our newsrooms to be able to actually handle massively investigative stories that cut across different jurisdictions and different kind of legal jurisdictions. So that's the one thing that I've taken away from this as well. And I think the other thing is that African journalists, the typical model used to be that big global stories were, the African parts were outsourced to African journalists as stringers, and then information fed back into titles in North America or wherever. Whereas that's not the case anymore. I think now the Panama Papers has shown us that, in fact, the big global stories can actually be written from an African perspective by Africans and for an African audience. I don't know if you want to have any last thoughts on that, Will, Amanda, and Khadija.
If you want them.
By the way, I can hear we're having a collaborative phone call from ICFJ as well. So if somebody could just shut Patrick up there, that'd be nice.
I don't.
But leave that aside. Will, Amanda, or Khadija, any last thoughts?
I think one of the ways in which the iLab is ahead of the world is that we have data, financial, forensic experts, prosecutorial experts, and we've found a way to transcend the silos of journalism so that when these journalists are writing a story, they are advised and develop that story within the context of advice from an accountant where that's required. Whereas other media houses, even top titles overseas, would still work within those traditional paradigms. And this is something that we virtually deploy at no cost to all of the African media houses around the continent and work with them in collaboration. So we are trying to develop them to the point where they no longer need us. And in so doing, they become the experts and the masters of these narratives. And that's something that I think hasn't been done globally before.
Great. I think that's probably a good moment to stop. So I'd like to thank Amanda and Will and Khadija for helping us to talk about this, and thank Dow Jones for the sponsorship of this webinar, and hopefully we'll see you and hear from you during the next one. Thanks, guys.